Today is September 17th, 2025, and my guest is political scientist Anthony Gill of the University of Washington. This is Tony's third appearance on the program. He was last here in November of 2017, talking about tipping. Our topic for today is shampoo, something I really have no interest in, but actually we're going to talk about something much deeper and profound, and I'm pretty sure you, the listeners, will find it as interesting as I did when I read an essay of Tony's in the Library of Economics and Liberty, which hosts EconTalk, and we will put that essay up online. Tony, welcome back to EconTalk.
Thanks. Glad to be here. And I love shampoo. I used it this morning. So
who knew? So you open your essay with a very simple question, and it seems to have a very simple answer, and you suggest that simple answer is wrong. The question is, who or what enforces property rights in America, say? And what's the simple answer?
Well, the answer is obvious. It's the government, because the government writes these rules. These rules are put into books. The books are put into the deep recesses of libraries, and everybody can go see the rules of these property rights, right? And that's obvious. When I ask that of my students, they automatically turn to the answer: the government defines property rights.
Well, they have police, courts. They enforce the property rights. Seems true.
Yeah, seems very obvious. I actually have an exercise. I have my students, I strand them on a deserted island, a very typical trope within economics, have them build a society. And I say, who's going to determine who gets to use what? And their answer is, well, it's the government. And then you have to ask them, well, who is the government? And how do we decide on how the government is? How do we decide how to decide? And then I also pause and ask them, I go, well, it's obvious that the government defines property rights. So when was the last time that you read the rules? You went to the Federal Register here in the United States or to our regulatory codes in state of Washington. When was the last time you read those and knew those? Nobody reads these things. No. So that's the wrong answer. Well, it's not, I shouldn't say entirely the wrong answer. The government does define property rights, and it will take time to monitor and enforce them in certain circumstances. But for the most part, it's not the right answer.
And in a huge portion of circumstances, and we talk about this a lot in this program, there are what we might call unwritten rules, norms, and other things that determine who can do what with what. And somehow that brings us to shampoo, which by the way, I also use today. And my children mock me. I shampoo twice. They think, so I do rinse and repeat. They think I'm a victim of the shampoo industry, but I like the way it feels after two shampoos. So what's this have to do with shampoo?
Well, first of all, you should rather rinse and repeat, because that's what the rule says there on the bottle, right? You don't want to be violating any kind of rules. So, well, this is a little puzzle that has flummoxed me for a long time. And we can maybe talk a little bit later about why this puzzle started to eat at me and why it became an issue. But I know many people go to hotels all around the world. And if you've been traveling for several decades, you'll know that a lot of hotels provide you with these small personal use shampoo bottles, conditioners. Sometimes in the fancy restaurants, they have mouthwash. I love those things. I absolutely love them. I love them so much that I actually have a whole bin. And this is just one bin of these little shampoo bottles. And for those of you listening, I just held up a rather heavy bin of these little tiny shampoo bottles. Absolutely fascinated by them. However, it was a few years ago, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, especially when I traveled down to California, that I noticed that hotels were not doing this anymore. They put dispensers on the wall. So it was a large bottle. Sometimes it was directly connected to the wall. Sometimes they just put it on the ledge. They had a large bottle there. And this irritated me because I love collecting these little bottles and taking them home. I use them on a regular basis. I don't think I'll ever have to buy shampoo for the rest of my life. And it started, I had this kind of question here, and I was recently at the Stevenson Institute at Wabash University. I had stayed at the Liberty Fund a few nights before, and they had a hotel they put me in a hotel that had a dispenser on the wall. But when I went to Stevenson Institute, they had little bottles. And so I'm sitting there in the hotel room and thinking about this. And I said, well, wait a minute. If I'm allowed to take these little shampoo bottles home, and everybody knows that. I ask people, can I take these little shampoo bottles home? They go, of course you can. Everybody knows you can. I go, well.
And I just want to put in a footnote. You take them home sometimes, Tony, I'm going to guess, even when you haven't opened them. So if you opened one and you shampooed once or twice, and now it's a third empty, you would feel really okay with taking it home because they're not going to leave it for another customer. So you take it home. But the next step, which, you may be a felon. This is a dangerous conversation. The next step is to say, well, I brought my own, and as it turned out. And so it's there implicitly, and that word's very important, implicitly, it's included in the price of the hotel. It's free. In fact, more than it's free, I paid for it. It's not free. It's built into the price with a bunch of other amenities in the room. The towels I get to use, the sheets I get to use, and so on. And so it's totally okay to take a full, unopened little tiny bottle of shampoo, because that's included as sort of a gift to me as the customer. And in fact, many hotels say, instead, for the other range of things, particularly, if you forgot fill in the blank, we have some available for you. So toothpaste, other things, dental floss, who knows, a toothbrush. You could buy one from them. They might give it to you as a way of showing you, making the customer experience more pleasant. But your point here is that you haven't opened it. It's sitting there in the little basket. And as you're putting away your toiletries and packing up to leave, of course, you put that in your bag because it's considered part of it's mine.
Yeah, and I go through many rationalizations on this too. It's that, it's like food, like crackers at a restaurant, is that once they put them on the table, they're contaminated and they have to throw them out anyway. So I might as well take it home and use it. I don't know if that's true or not, but it certainly is a good rationalization. And I should not admit this, but it's even more addictive for me that at conferences, I will seek out the bald people and ask them, hey, you're not using your shampoo. Would you mind bringing them down for me? So somebody would think that's horrible. And that's horrible. The reaction I got when I raised this question we were at a small conference at Wabash. And the next question that I raised to them, I think horrified them. Right. The first thing is that we can take these little shampoo bottles home, right? And say, oh, of course, everybody knows that. Everybody knows that. I go, well, can I take the large dispenser bottles home with me? And they were horrified. They said, well, of course you can't. No. There might be one reason. The bigger bottles are 16 ounces and you can't get through TSA. I said, well, I'll check my bag. I'll just put it underneath the thing so I can take that bottle home. But they were horrified. No, you can't do that. I go, why not? Why can't you do that? Because what's the difference between this is 3 ounces or so and the 12-ounce bottle? It's just shampoo, right? If they want me to,
the better example you give in your essay is, can I just bring an empty one and fill it from the dispenser since I didn't use my share? I'm entitled to 3 ounces, and I might not have used it all, so I can fill my empty bottle that I brought from home with that. And that, I think that would also I assume that would horrify him too.
It does. And yeah. I do that because I am so addicted to these little shampoo bottles. I love containers, any kind of containers, right? So I admit I have a problem there. I will bring empty bottles, and if I know it's going to be a certain hotel brand that did go to the dispensers, and I will fill it up, especially if I like the shampoo. There are some hotels that I really like the shampoo, other ones not so much. So I will, and people are shocked by this. They're like, oh my gosh, how can you do this? Well, I consider this, since these hotels started introducing these small bottles some 50 years ago or so, I consider it, a right that whenever I pay the price of a hotel room, I should get at least 3 ounces of shampoo and conditioner. So they were horrified. Who would do that? Now that horror, the horror, I guess it would be bemused horror. I wasn't ostracized, but it was this bemused horror. But it's going to become important a little bit later in terms of enforcement of property rights. But yeah, that's a good question. What's wrong with me taking, 3 ounces of shampoo from the dispenser and putting it into the small bottle?
Or 2 or 3 small bottles. I
will not. I'm going to stop and plead the Fifth Amendment right there. So
okay.
But
it reminds me of the in one of the, I think it's the first Marx Brothers movie, The Coconuts, which is pretty good. Doesn't reach the level of their later masterpieces, but in The Coconuts, I think Harpo and Chico check into the hotel and they're bringing their suitcases, and they run into somebody and the suitcases spill open, and the porter says, "These suitcases are empty," and Harpo or Chico says, "Yeah, well, they won't." Well, it would be Chico. Chico says, "Well, there won't be when we leave," because in those days there was kind of a thing about towels. That you could kind of, sort of, not literally take a towel. Wasn't really okay. It was stealing, but the enforcement mechanism is imperfect. And I would think I've never stolen a towel in my life. I'm going on record here, but I wonder, would they really enforce it? A bathrobe, yes. They make it very clear that if you want a bathrobe that they've hung up, you can buy it. They give you a price. So it's clear that you can't it's not included. But it's a fascinating question of, that property right is sort of enforced by something else. And most of us, maybe not you, Tony, I'm learning more about you by the minute, but most of us would say it's wrong to put the towel in my suitcase, even though I can. And many people would say it's wrong to put the dispenser of shampoo in my suitcase, even though I maybe can. I'm not sure if they'd call you and say, "Hey, we noticed that was missing." But they're certainly not going to call you to see for excess shampoo use because you filled up an extra 3-ouncer out of their wall dispenser.
Right. And it's not only that. I probed people more on this because it started to get a conversation going. This is an early morning breakfast. People were still a little bit sleepy. And I started perking up people. And I, when I asked, can I take the 12-ounce dispenser bottle? And there was a rather esteemed political economist there who said, no, you can't. It's illegal. And I said, well, show me the law that says thou shalt not take the 12-ounce bottle of shampoo. And again, it's interesting to note that, because the fact that this person said it's against the law immediately told me, this person defaults to the government setting property rights. And I entirely acknowledge, yes, stealing is wrong. In fact, you go to the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal. Okay, now there's codes in our government rule books that said this is a robbery, this is a burglary, this is a felony offense, this is a misdemeanor, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think there's one specifically related to 16-ounce bottles of shampoo. And again, what's the difference between 3 ounces and 16 ounces? Where does that line draw? If it was a 5-ounce bottle, is it okay? If it's 10 ounces, where does this line get drawn? And I think that was really kind of the interesting question that got a lot of people to start thinking about, how do we define what's stealing? And therefore, how do we define what's property rights? Is it really the government that does that?
And we're going to get to the answer in a second. I just want to add one more example, which I think about a lot, and I think it applies to a lot of different things. So all retail establishments, and hotels would be an example of a particular kind of retail establishment, they all have to deal with shoplifting, which is a fancy word for stealing. It means stealing that's not from another person's personal property, but from a corporation or an institution's property. And we all understand that the prices we pay include a premium for shoplifting. Shoplifting is priced into the prices in every store we're in. There's some amount that is tolerated because it's too expensive to monitor it perfectly. And so a store to stay in business has built into its pricing the understanding that some things will walk away. Mm-hmm. And I assume in the old days, when people were poor and towels were more scarce and more expensive, people did steal towels. and from hotels more often, and the price of a room had to include implicitly a possibility that you would steal the towel, or worse, as an example you give in the essay, a mattress. Now, it's harder, as you point out, it's hard to steal a mattress in a quiet fashion. But this leads many economics students to what I think is an immoral conclusion. And I don't know if you're going to agree with this, Tony. They will say, well, since I'm paying for the shoplifting in the price, I'm entitled to take some things for myself without paying for them, because I'm already paying for them when I buy stuff. So similarly, the argument could be, since some towels get stolen and therefore the price is higher for the hotel room, I'm entitled to take a towel with me now and then because I'm paying for it. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that becomes a slippery slope for me. I love that rationalization for being able to take 16-ounce bottles of shampoo home. And even the mattress. The mattress example that I give in the article was forwarded by the person who says, well, there's a law against stealing the hotel stuff. You can't take a mattress. And my initial response was, of course I'm not going to steal the mattress. It doesn't fit into my carry-on. Right. So it's not practical for me to do that. But, and the person at the front desk is going to notice when you're carrying a very large mattress or a television set out the front door of the hotel. So what you just said, it's just, I'm entitled to do that. So everybody else is doing it. It's built into the price. So why don't I just do that? I actually don't go that far. So you are learning more about me, and so far you may have been a little bit horrified, bemusedly horrified that I take bottles and fill them up with shampoo. But I am not such a felon that I go all the way to taking mattresses or even the full 16-ounce bottles of shampoo. So rest assured that I don't do that. There's something there that's stopping me, right? And this is really, I think, interesting. It connects to a lot of things that you're interested in too, namely Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, where I know I'm in the hotel room. I could take a bunch of stuff. Nobody's going to find out. But I don't do it anyways. There's something there stopping me, right? There's a self-monitoring aspect to all of this. And I want to give one more example in the hotel room that just really horrified individuals because it's actually quite important here.
Yeah.
We were talking about shampoos. The conversation turned to mattresses. But I said, well, what about toilet paper? Right?
Great example.
You're halfway through a roll of toilet paper, and why can't I take that home? That fits into my carry-on suitcase. And again, everybody was shocked. Like, who would ever think of doing that? That's the most horrifying thing. And I reminded them that during the pandemic in 2020, early on, toilet paper was at a premium. And so if you were traveling or out somewhere, why not an additional half a roll? It's basically the same cost of a small bottle. But there was just an abject horror that anybody would ever think of doing that. So I don't do that. Right? I'm not going to take. Yeah.
I just want to add that when people say you're allowed to shoplift, or there's a gray area, which I didn't mention, which is grapes. In Italy, I was just in Italy, they don't let you touch the fruit. You can't pick up a nectarine and give it a little squeeze, see how fresh or ripe it is. You can't touch the grapes. You can't squeeze the Charmin, if I may use a bad example. Here in Israel, you can touch it all you want, and you're kind of allowed to taste the grapes, of course. Can't take a peach and take a bite out of it and say, no, it seems like it is going to be ripe. But one grape is it's understood that that's okay. And that leads to a question which is related to your ounces of shampoo. Well, if one's okay, a second would be probably okay too, just to make sure. But 12 would be too many, and probably 4 would be too many. And the question then is why? And how is it that we have an aversion to the 6th grape or the toilet paper roll or the towel when, as you say, there's no legislative piece of document that's keeping us from doing this? Something else is doing that. And the last thing I want to add is this is Kant's categorical imperative. If everybody ate 12 grapes because they don't monitor it, grapes would be very expensive because the premium they'd have to charge for the people tasting and sampling and enjoying them, it would have to be priced into the fruit. And we don't want to live in that world. We don't want to live in a world where we have to pay an extra premium and then feel like I'm entitled to my share. And so what certain moral codes do, at least ideally, is to self-monitor us and make us realize that is not a world that would be a good world. And the other way I think about it is, if you ask the owner of the store, "Can I have a grape?" He'll say, "Oh yeah," in Israel, not in Italy. In Italy, he'll give you a horrible look if you can get near the grape with your hands. But if you ask the guy in Israel, "Can I have a grape?" or in most American stores, they'll say, "Sure." "Can I have a cluster?" No. So there's no, there is a gray line that's not drawn, but it's clear that the grapes aren't really free to sample. They're free to taste one. That's the implicit deal that's on the table. And the question you raise, I think in your piece, which is beautiful, is where does that come from? Where does that come from?
I want to point out something that you just did when you were talking about Kant's categorical imperative. You acted very much like a good economist. You thought, well, if everybody takes a number of grapes, then the price of grapes gets too high, and we don't want high price of grapes. So you did the whole cost-benefit calculation there, and that was wonderful. That's the great economic answer that I have my students think about when we think about collective action problems and free riding and the tragedy of the commons. But, is that really the thought process that you go through? Why am I not taking all these grapes or a handful of grapes? I think the answer comes down to because my mother told me not to do that.
Yeah.
When I was 3 years old or 5 years old, and it was reinforced there. So it was something that, not that there's a calculation that we go through. Maybe
Fair
somebody
enough.
did that calculation, but it's just like you were drilled from, day one, don't take a handful of grapes, don't steal, thou shalt not steal. And it comes in a lot of different forms, right? You kind of learn. It's like, well, you don't take 3 or 4 grapes, but you also don't take somebody else's toy when, they're playing with it or something like that. So, and those things is what helps to monitor us, but it also creates a certain milieu that it says in our society, it is not proper to do these things. And if you want to be seen as a propitious person, somebody who is concerned about propriety, then you should not be taking these things. And that starts to act as this internal brake upon us. It helps us to self-monitor with the assistance of civil society reminding us constantly, ever since we were children, that this is how a proper person behaves.
Yeah, it's just I should have explained a little bit. The categorical imperative of Kant is if you're deciding whether to do something, you should ask, well, what if everyone acted this way? And that's if you don't like the answer to that, you would realize that it's not a good thing to do. And I agree with you. I don't think people say, oh, this would, when I invoke the categorical imperative, but what they actually do is they have certain norms that come from parenting, school, church, you name it, where they're told what is right and wrong. And those norms come from somewhere. And that's what's fascinating. Why? And they differ by society. Italy and Israel and fruit being an example, right? In some societies, it's okay to take more than one grape. And in some, you're not allowed to take any. And I hope I'm not being unfair to Italy. I was in, I think, at least 2 Italian cities this summer where both times I was told not to touch the fruit and was glared at. But those norms, there's 2 issues. Where do they come from and what enforces them? They're 2 separate questions.
Mm-hmm. And if you want me to answer that question, I'm going to shrug my shoulders and say, I'm not really so sure about that. As for where they come from, boy, those questions get really murky. Our last episode that we recorded together many years ago on tipping, the question comes up, well, who started tipping? And as far as we can know, it was sometime in the 16th century in Britain, but it's really murky. These are things that just kind of emerge, right? So we talk about how prices affect economic allocation, and you get this emergent order that Hayek always talks about. But these things happen too, not only with prices and the allocation of resources, but with rules. So rules somehow emerge from there as well. And Hayek has written some really great stuff on this in Law, Legislation, and Liberty about the evolution of norms. And we can talk about the evolution of norms, but where they come from, oh boy, that's really hard to know because they just kind of evolve. How they work?
But I would suggest they evolve in trial and error and all kinds of complex ways, but they stick because they work.
Yes.
And there's more than one norm that can work. And I think the most important thing is that there is a norm in many situations. There's an expectation of what is appropriate behavior. If it's 6 ounces of shampoo, that's okay. If it's 3 ounces, that's okay. And if it's 0, that's okay. But once you know the norm, so if hotels don't provide shampoo, which is, I'm sure, the way it was in the 16th century in England, while we're on the subject, you walked into a inn in the Cotswolds, and you didn't ask for the shampoo. You brought, there wasn't any, but in the world, but if you wanted to use a product, you brought it with you. And because we got wealthier as a society and the world got wealthier, hotels could relatively inexpensively make sure that you didn't have to worry about it. And that's why it persisted. That's why that norm came to be for those precious decades, Tony, of your in the 70s and 80s and 90s, when you got the little bottles. That was the norm. You went to the hotel, you didn't bring your own shampoo because you knew the hotel would have it for you. So that was convenient and that was nice. But if people start taking them like you, eventually they went to the wall dispenser because they realized that not everybody really needs it each time. And some people don't use the whole bottle and they're only there for one, et cetera, et cetera. And so they found it less expensive to give you the wall dispenser, which is really for the customer. This is the most crazy part of these kind of norms that emerge because it was really expensive. If everybody filled their empty bottles, brought them with them and emptied the wall dispenser, they'd stop doing it because I wouldn't want to stay at the hotel anymore because the price would have to be so high to cover the cost of the wall dispenser being emptied and the towels being used and the TV being tucked under your arm when you left. So in a dishonest society where norms are ignored or the norms are, awful, certain things don't get provided. It might not even get a hotel room because people would pull up the rug and take the mattress. And I mean, it sounds like a ludicrous comedy, but that's really a possibility. There are many things in a society without trust where norms are unobserved, not observed by the people. You can't have certain products.
And that's a really important observation here that goes to the larger picture of what I was trying to get at, is that if we just rely upon the government to define property rights, to monitor them and to enforce them, we have a problem because the government can't do that all the time. There are so many different opportunities where we go unmonitored and we could get away with everything. So we need a strong civic society, a strong sense of trust and honesty within society to make the economy work. It's very, very important in those kind of things. And again, to go back to your question, where does this come from and how does it evolve? It's a very interesting and mysterious question. I mean, to think about the issue of shampoo, and you got me thinking now that I'm kind of a norm entrepreneur by telling people to take small bottles and fill them in the dispenser, right? Now I feel like I'm undermining Western civilization somehow,
you
right?
are.
And if nobody can get a hotel room anymore because, the price went up because Gill convinced everybody to swipe the shampoo, I'm going to feel a little bit horrible about that. I don't think that will happen. But when it comes to the evolution of these things, I always ask students, and I think this is a good exercise for students to do, is to think about the origin of that norm. And first of all, where did these small bottles initially come from? And I said, I'm going to be on EconTalk. I better do some background research on this in case, Russ asked me, when did this shampoo bottle thing start to occur? As far as we can tell, it was about 1970 in London. The Four Seasons hotels started providing these. Why did they do that? Who knows? Somebody thought, hey, this would be a really nice convenience for people. They don't have to bring a big bottle in their suitcase, which spills open. So some entrepreneur had that idea. And then other people must have noticed it. So it started to build upon itself. But then the question becomes, who decided that you could take these bottles away? Because everyone knows, and I was told everyone knows, that you can take the small bottles home. Well, who was the first one who did that? And how did that get communicated? Well, that becomes really kind of an interesting question of how this happens. And again, it's just little tiny, oh yeah, I brought this wonderful bottle of shampoo home. It smells really great. And somebody else said, oh, I could do that. And the word just kind of gets around. And then pretty soon everybody knows. And that's kind of neat. That's how a lot of our rules about property rights evolve. And it happens in every aspect of your life. We're just talking about shampoo here. But I will ask my students sometimes, who owns the sidewalks, right, outside the University of Washington? And the answer is really easy. Well, it's the government, right? The government owns it. Or somebody will be a little bit more sophisticated and say, well, the government is we the people, so it's public property and domains. I go, that's true. But you make claims on the sidewalk every so often. So, you're walking down with a group of friends and 3 or 4 people, and somebody's coming by in the opposite direction in a wheelchair. Now who, quote unquote, owns the sidewalk for that moment in time? And typically what will happen in, I think, a well-functioning society, or at least one that I believe is well-functioning, is that we'll move over to the side to let the person in the wheelchair pass. Right? There's a norm about property use there. So it's a public domain property. It's unspecified how it could actually be used. And we need to get outside of our mentality that, there's just one thing and it has one use, and that's the property right of it. Different types of assets or pieces of property or things have different uses. And how we define those things is going to be determined a lot by the social norms in terms of this. And it's kind of interesting to think about this, too. I used to do an experiment in my political economy class, especially when I had smaller classes. If I had a group of 20 students, I'd be in a classroom that maybe had 30 seats. And on the first day of class, I would get in early and I'd put warning labels on some of the chairs and then some security tape, usually around 15 chairs. So now I created artificial scarcity. There's 20 students and there's now 15 chairs. So who is going to get these chairs is an interesting question. And usually, I'm really sneaky on this, I would contact one student ahead of time and say, I need you to help role play something for me. I would like you to come into class late, and I'm going to give you a pair of crutches, and I want you to come in. So 20 students will be in, 15 chairs are there. The 15 chairs will usually fill up by a very common property rule called first come, first serve. The 4 students that come in after late sit on the floor, and now comes in the person on crutches. And I just sit there wondering, okay, what's going to happen? Is somebody going to stand up and give the seat to the person who looks like they have a sprained ankle or not? And I'm implicitly trying to look at what is the property rule that's going on here. Do students who attend the University of Washington have a certain norm that says we will defer to the person who is injured rather than our own selfish interest here? And the results were interesting. Most of the time, nobody got up and offered their seat to the person.
Really? Well, in Israel, they would have. I got here on bus today, and I'm fighting a cold, and I get on the bus, and there's no empty seats, and a 16-year-old girl stands up and gives me her seat. And normally I would just say, thank you, I'm fine, but I don't feel so great. So I took the seat. She obviously saw I was significantly older than her. And that happens here all the time. That's the norm. Old people, I've got gray hair, so I'm old. we get seats, and pregnant women get seats, and children give up their seats, let alone adults, for people who, quote, need them more than others, whatever that means. But I think we know what it means. The other point I want to bring in relates to the conversation I had with Mike Munger on this wonderful idea of obedience to the unenforceable. So these are unenforceable rules. They're not going to frisk you when you leave the hotel. They're not going to search your bag. They could. I mean, they really could. I mean, we think it sounds ludicrous, but of course they frisk us and search us at the airport to make sure we're not bringing in certain things onto the plane. They can certainly do the same thing at the hotel to make sure we're not taking things out of the hotel. And so it's unenforced. And yet most people don't fill up an empty bottle of a significant size or steal the wall dispenser. And the reason that's important, I think, is easy to miss. One is it avoids the constant litigiousness of having to decide and weigh and figure out whether it's a violation or not. But the beauty of the unenforced norms is that there's some play in them. So that in your particular circumstance, you might be needing that seat. So it's first come, first serve, absolutely. And yet, if you're old, on crutches, maybe pregnant, you might find that people give up their seat and they feel they do not have the property right to that seat. Maybe not in your classes, but in general, people will be flexible. And otherwise, you have to have a whole code book. Well, you have to be of a certain age, a certain infirmity. Crutches are okay, but not if it's a cast. I mean, if it's just a sprained ankle, right? So instead of having to list all the categories of possibility, it takes care of itself. You know, the example we used here many times is when you sell your house, you have to have it, and you leave it, it has to be clean. You leave a house in America. I don't know if this is a rule everywhere, but in America, the norm is, and there's some phrase probably in the contract literally about in decent condition or good cleanliness, but it's a vague word. There's no such thing. Is it perfectly clean? Is it mopped, swept, polished, burnished? And the answer is it's that level of cleanliness emerges from our expectations. And if I violate it horribly, if I leave trash in the house, then I'm going to get in trouble. But otherwise, it's kind of left up to the goodwill of the people on both sides of the part of the contract. And that, when you have a society that people live up to their expectations because they're not enforced, you have a wonderful world because you don't have to devote resources to monitoring and enforcement. And more importantly, you don't have to study a book to figure out what are the expectations because you breathe those in the air as you're suggesting. And that really is Hayek's insane idea, which I don't really fully understand, is that what judges should do is enforce expectations. When they have a court case of whether someone violated the law or not, it's not you go look at the past, you look at the legislation. You try to understand what was reasonable, what would people expect in that situation, and if they didn't live up to it, they're guilty, and if they did, they're innocent, period, which is a wild, crazy idea.
The word that you used in there that I really love is flexibility. It's flexibility in interpreting what the norm is and in punishing the violations of the norm there. And this is why I love civil society and social norms as a way of doing this. Because again, if we had to legislate and to litigate every single rule, wow, does that take up a lot of time? And people start fighting over these definitions. And by the way, social scientists love very clear definitions. But at the end of the day, we know that definitions have a lot of gray fuzziness around them. Yeah. And that is going to lead to more conflict. And so what's beautiful about the property rights that revolve around social norms is that they're flexible in their interpretation and enforcement. And for me, that also leads to this other term that I like to talk about a lot is graciousness, right? Is that somebody may violate a norm at some point in time. You go, oh my gosh, that's the most horrible thing. But if you learn about their context or the situation, you're like, oh, okay, well, we understand that we don't need to enforce it. There isn't a bright line enforcement here. So we go back to tipping. If you're at a restaurant or your local bar and everybody's used to tipping 20% or something, and somebody comes in and they order a beer, but they don't really tip. They just maybe drop a quarter on the bar stand or something. You're like, oh my gosh, that person is really horrible. They got received good service. But if you know, oh yeah, that's Bill, and Bill was just laid off at the local airplane factory. That's really kind of sad. You give a lot more benefit, more grace to this person, which all economies need to do, because when we create contracts and relate to one another in our transactions, there's going to be errors. And we need, as a society, in order for those contracts to constantly be renewed and to be practiced in other venues, we need to accept the fact that sometimes mistakes happen. And you need to be gracious about that. So yeah, there are rules. You try not to cheat a customer, but sometimes something goes wrong. Okay, I'm sorry about that. We'll make it up next time. Those are the kind of things that I think really help to foster a prosperous economy.
And there's a role for trust here we haven't talked about. Norms work especially well and fail if trust is not. They work well when there's trust, and they don't work very well when there isn't trust. So if I walk into your class, or better yet, I'll get on the bus, and I'm dragging my leg like I'm limping because I want to get a seat, and I take advantage of this norm here in Israel that says if you're in distress, you will get a seat. I'm a cheater. I'm a free rider, and we all understand that happens. People are imperfect. The civil society doesn't work perfectly. And in a minute, we'll come to Adam Smith, because you alluded to him earlier. We need to go into more detail. But if everybody does that, then the norm just is destroyed. The norm that says help a person, give up, even though it's first come, first serve. If a person's in distress, give them your chair, and everybody fakes it, puts a basketball under their shirt. And I remember picking up a hitchhiker when I was young and naive. She was extremely pregnant, and she was frantic. And I thought, oh my God, this woman's about to give birth. So I let her into my car, expecting to be directed to the hospital, and she instead directed me to her neighborhood where she needed some drugs. And that was a disappointment, because it wasn't. I think she lit a cigarette immediately and getting into the car. So that was a person who cheated on the norm. And if everybody does that, the norm can't survive. And so there's a certain base level of honesty, and coming back to Kant and parents telling us what the right thing to do is. If you don't have any of that, very hard to sustain these kind of norms. These norms are flexible because it's presumed that people who take advantage of them are honest. If everybody who was speeding said, "Oh, I'm taking," with their wife in the car, was pregnant, and said, "Oh, she's in delivery, she's in labor," and told a terrible story that was a lie, everybody would have to get a ticket, whether they were giving birth or not, and that's a disaster. So it's a very interesting question. It's a separate question of how that trust gets established. I feel like actually we're losing a lot of that in the West these days, and we're going to pay a terrible price for it, which is very sad.
I think there's a crowd out effect too when we defer to that answer of, who enforces these rules, and we all say the government. Well, we become very lazy then. We don't have to follow the norm because we know the government is going to, be there to solve it. Well, the government isn't always there, but if we start cheating along the margins every so often, these norms start to break down. And I've seen the same kind of thing in airlines. When you board a plane, people who need help to get on the plane, yeah. I'm happy to do that. If somebody's really kind of struggling in a wheelchair and they need a little extra help, that's fine. But I've noticed over the past 5, 6, 7 years that once that announcement is made, the people who can board first, there's a flood of people that look perfectly fine getting on the plane.
Yeah.
And, okay, maybe some disabilities are unseen and things like this, but my suspicion is that with, less and less overhead baggage space, there's a desire to get on first to get your bag up there.
Yeah, no, it's a real problem. And that's a great example, because that is not priced. The amount of space for your carry-on is not priced, and it's first come, first serve. And usually most people get their bags in, but not everybody.
Yep. Yeah. So that becomes, I think, a huge issue here. And I've also seen, going back to our tipping conversation many years ago, the norm of tipping, which I love, has really eroded because now
Terribly, yeah.
everybody is asking for a tip. And they're asking for tips in places that are not appropriate. A self-serve frozen yogurt place has a tip jar there? No, absolutely not. If somebody just gets me a cup of drip coffee instead of a fancy latte, I don't tip. But there's this scowl like, well, why shouldn't you tip? I go, because it doesn't solve the principal agent problem. You don't, so it becomes a big issue there too. And I think that's something that we need to keep an eye on. It's difficult for social scientists to measure this or even to want to study it. But, thinking about levels of honesty and trust in society are really indicators of where the society is going in terms of prosperity and productivity and whether or not
in certain cities in America, it felt like, I don't know if this is true or not, but it felt like stealing a car was not really a big deal. If somebody broke into your car and stole something from it or took the car itself, and you go to the police and they just like shrug and look at you like, what are you, crazy? What happens? We can't, there's so many of them, we can't track everyone down. Something's gone terribly wrong when that's the case, compared to the alternative where you could leave your car unlocked. Those days, of course, are over. But there's just a whole range of things in our everyday life that we don't think about that are monitored and enforced by an enormous range of personal choices we make, as well as how we react. So the person who doesn't leave the tip, who drops a quarter at the bar, if we all know he lost his job this week, we're all going to judge him one way. If we don't think that's the case, we're going to judge him a different way and try to alter his behavior. And that brings us to Adam Smith. What's this have to do with Adam Smith?
So one of and I thank you for doing this. I go back to your episodes with Dan Klein and going through the theory of moral sentiments, which is a difficult book to get through. And there's a lot going on in there. And I'm still wrestling with it. But one of your favorite phrases, and I think there's a drinking game with this now, but so you listeners get ready. But Adam Smith tells us that humans love to be loved and to be lovely. And I wrestled with that for a while. When I first started hearing you discuss this and the phrase, I said, okay, I kind of get the idea of loved. And, being a good rational choice political economist in the past, I understood what it meant to be loved. You put somebody high up in the preference profile, so thinking that way. But the issue of to be lovely is really kind of interesting. And I didn't really wrap my head around it, but this whole instance of talking to people of taking shampoo or toilet paper from hotels really kind of brought this back home to me. And to be lovely is to be cognizant of the social rules around you and wanting to conform to that in a way that people in the future want to interact with you. You want to be seen as somebody who fits in and is doing the right thing. And Smith uses the word propriety quite a bit. So I think that connects here very well. And so to go back to my instance, when I talked about, well, is it okay to take a half roll of toilet paper home from the hotel? And you could just see everybody in the room gasp, like, who would ever do that? Right? Who would ever absolutely do that? And now, that was probably not the right question for me to ask, because now every time I'm at a conference and I'm leaving the conference hotel and reeling my bag there, all my friends are going to be looking at me, looking at that suitcase going, does he have toilet paper in there? What an oddball. I don't know if I can, trust him to work on a paper with me and things like this. I might no longer be lovely. And so what happens more, not just that in the hotel lobby where people are looking at you and you're wondering, what are people thinking about me and lovely? That actually occurs in the hotel room when there's nobody around. The doors are closed and I'm sitting there looking at the half roll of toilet paper, say, boy, could really use that at home. But what if somebody saw me take that? Well, nobody's going to see me take that. But I know that somebody's looking there. And again, this is a very impartial spectator here. If you're religious, maybe there's that supreme impartial spectator, God looking down on you saying, I know what you're doing there. And so that will put the brakes on me. I won't take the toilet paper home because I do want to be lovely. And I finally just kind of thinking through that, really internalized, got an intuitive sense for what that means and how strong of an impact that is on human behavior. It's stronger than, putting more and more police into a city. And again, going back to it's okay to steal cars now or go shoplifting and things. We've experienced quite a bit of that in Seattle recently. Well, the result of that is that you get the National Guard coming into your town. I don't want that. That's really bad. And so we need to kind of cultivate that desire to be lovely, that conforming to the social norms that are set for us, and that being propitious, wanting to be a person who engages in propriety and who's prudent in all their behaviors.
Well, I think Adam Smith would say, even though no one is watching, at least one person is who isn't divine, and that's you.
Yeah.
The person themselves, and we judge ourselves. For me, the impartial spectator, the idea of it is, this is, I think Smith was suggesting this is both a positive and a normative theory. Positive meaning this is how people actually behave, and normative meaning, well, this is what they should do. You should act as if you are being observed by someone who is not your friend, who's not going to give you the benefit of the doubt, who's not going to say, well, he's had a hard day. And that excuses doing the wrong thing. No, Smith says an impartial person would just say, well, that was wrong what you did. Shouldn't have taken the toilet paper. And I think, obviously, religion can play a role, but Smith believed, rightly or wrongly, and this is the positive part of theory, does this really work? Do people actually behave this way? And I think it's worth taking seriously. Certainly, I think about, I can see it here on my shelf, the book by Roy Baumeister called Evil. It says, it's called Evil, Inside Human Violence and Cruelty. And it's a very dark book. I've never finished it. It's very depressing. I don't think that's the only reason I didn't finish it, but I'm just saying I haven't read the whole thing. But the book opens with a number of gruesome murders, and the murderers don't say, "Yeah, I did it. It was that person deserved it." Excuse me. Yes, I did it. Period. They always have an excuse. They do. Even murderers want to be lovely. They want to see themselves as being justified. One of the most extraordinary pieces of audio I've ever heard is from This American Life. They have an episode called, I think it's called Act 5. It's about the performance of Hamlet in a maximum security prison. Prisoners put on Hamlet. And I may have gotten some of those details wrong, but we'll check it out. But the point is that performing that play, many of these people are murderers. Hamlet's about murder. They are forced to confront the idea that maybe they did the wrong thing. And they have lived for a long time with a belief that what they did was justified. Of course, they had to kill that person for whatever reason. Of course, that person had it coming to them. Of course, they provoked me. It's very hard for human beings to be absolutely evil and say, yeah, I did it. So what? Deep down, they're ashamed. This is an extraordinary thing. And of course, we all do terrible things, selfish things, petty things, cruel things unwittingly or without enough sensitivity. We're all flawed. But what Smith is saying is that we don't want to be flawed. Yes, we will lie to ourselves. We'll try to justify our selfishness. But deep down, we want to be lovely. We want to earn the respect of the people around us. And it's an amazing thing. And I think it has a lot to do with what you're talking about here in this essay and in our conversation, which is in most societies, much of what enforces property rights is our willingness to do the right thing.
Yeah, I love that division between the normative and positive aspects of what Smith is talking about in theory of moral sentiments. And the normative one is easy to understand. It's, your parents told you want to be well respected and well liked. And so you get that all the time. The positive aspect of it, and I agree with you, I think Smith is building a positive theory of why we behave the way we do. It's harder to really kind of reason through that because, again, it's not easy measurable for economists and sociologists to do this. But it's still, when I thought about it more and internalized it with the silly issues with the shampoo and toilet paper, how strongly that works upon my own behavior. I'm not taking the toilet paper home, even though I could, and nobody would know because I would know it. So what is causing that? That, civil society, the norms, and, the desire to be lovely is really working strongly on me. And you just mentioned the book Evil and kind of how depressing that is. This kind of stuff, and I like to play around with this with students, is actually rather uplifting. Taking silly examples of where we always are doing the right thing. Social scientists are always thinking about tragedies and crises and how to make the world better. I think it's sometimes useful for us to stop and say, actually things are working pretty well in a lot of places. Smith's desire for us to be loved and lovely is actually kind of working in a lot of places. People do give up their seats on the bus. People do. And eventually one of my classes somebody did get up and give the seat to somebody with the crutches. And I'm like, okay, that's really kind of cool, right? We're doing the right thing a lot more than we think we are. And I wish a lot more social scientists would pay attention to the really good things that come about this. We need to read Smith's theory of moral sentiments and not necessarily rue that the world is collapsing around us, but rather turn it around and say, wow, things are looking really good. What are we doing that's great here that makes living in this world a wonderful place?
And that brings us to our final topic, which is what caused you to write about shampoo? What provoked this essay?
Okay, so this is a little thing that I'm trying to do here at the end of my career is to get people interested in curiosity. And over the years, something has bothered me in academia that we're not really teaching people how to be curious, or what I like to say, how to be wonderful scholars. And by that, I mean filled with wonder. Our undergraduate students, they come to university and they want answers. So they file into our class and they say, I'm taking a class in political economy. Professor Gill put up all the answers on the board. I'll memorize those answers. I'll give them back to you on the exam. You'll give me a badge. I'll walk away with a sheepskin in 4 years and everything. I'm just a smart person. And that's horrible because they're not asking questions. I can give you answers. Answers are blue and 47.6. Those are great answers. But what's the question, right? The question is really preeminent in any kind of understanding. And I've seen the same thing in graduate students and even in faculty members now and scholars, right? It bothers me that somebody will come to me with a dissertation. I go, what's your dissertation about? And the first thing that comes out of their mouth, and this has literally happened, says, well, I have this data set that I'm going to analyze.
Yeah.
Right. And they've learned analytical techniques. We give them methods classes where we're teaching the most rigorous methods and robustness checks and all these different things. And they're wonderful at doing that. But why are they doing it? What's the question? What's the puzzle here? So about a decade ago in my graduate classes, I started doing something called exercise called Life's Little Mysteries. And the rules on this is we're political science, so we're concerned about social justice and war and very important topics. But the rule is that every week you have to put a question onto our discussion board that is about some mystery in your everyday life. It can't be profound. It has to be just something simple that maybe annoys you and you never really thought about, or you see some kind of difference. We get students from the East Coast and people jaywalk all the time in New York City, but nobody jaywalks in Seattle. And people kind of notice this, but they never really think about it. And I want students to stop and do that. And the reason I started doing this with graduate students, it was because you need to be curious. You need to have not only a question for your dissertation, but you need to develop a lifetime of curiosity of finding questions everywhere. And it's interesting because we don't teach that in methods classes, or rarely do we teach that. We just assume it's natural. Oh, you're curious, you're a scholar, so you must be curious. But curiosity needs to be cultivated and developed. And I tell students that, listen, if you can't do this in the little things in your life, that just within arm's reach or within, your eyesight, you're not going to be able to do it really effectively for the big things. You'll be good at analyzing things, and I'm sure you'll get nice publications with the proper coefficients and statistical significance and all that. That's wonderful. That helps you. But to have a fulfilled life, you really got to be wondering about the world. And I took this now to my undergraduates, and I'm now teaching a small one-credit course called How to Be Wonderful. And students have to, every week, come up with a question about what's interesting in your daily life. Nothing profound, has to be really simple. And I also challenge them to put their phone down, because they're very connected to the world. There's like, I'm very worldly, but they can't see exactly what's around them because everybody is walking with their phone across campus looking at that. And when I did this with my undergraduates, a number of them came back and said, yeah, this is the first time I walked across the quad and didn't have my phone out. And I noticed, the cherry trees are, in certain areas of the quad, and there's bumps in certain areas of the sidewalk here. And why is that happening? I was like, yes. You need to do that more. And I've had them come back and say, yeah, I've stopped walking around with my cell phone and I caught this bug. It takes a while to do. We had to do 10 weeks of this before people started to really get what we're doing here. But once they caught the bug, they start asking questions. And my graduate students have always begrudged me, this is really stupid, Professor Gill. But by the end of 8th or 9th week, they're like, this is really cool. And many of them continue doing it. And it becomes great talk for bar fodder and all this stuff. And I tell myself, I have to play along too. If I'm going to give my students this, I'm going to do this. And this is where this puzzle came along. I had a weekly assignment for myself to come up with this. And I said, hey, I was in 2 hotels here. One had the shampoo dispenser. The other one had the bottles. Why can't I take the bigger dispenser bottles, right? And again, people would say, you're not a serious scholar. This is not profound or anything. What happened at the Stevenson Institute at Wabash was that when I posed that question at breakfast, the next panel that we had, the whole discussion around property rights revolved around that issue of shampoo. And so even though it seems to be a trivial example, it then scaled up to, questions about mining rights in the Old West and how we, allocate resources on freeways and all these kind of things. So the little things in life, if you can't understand and be curious about the little things in life, the bigger things in life are going to pass you by too. So if there's anything I could tell scholars out there or just anybody else, is be a wonderful person. Look around, be curious, be puzzled, find ways to be puzzled, and find ways to wonder about the world so that you too can be wonderful.
Well, that was beautiful. There's a question we didn't ask. You mentioned it in passing in the article, which is, if you ask the hotel why they replaced the little bottles with the big bottle, they would say, oh, we care about the environment, it's less packaging, we're saving on plastic. But my guess is, and I'm sorry to bring this back to you personally, there may have been so many people taking the little bottles, they figured, if we put the bigger bottles on the wall, we're going to save some money. And of course, through competition, if it works beautifully, it doesn't always, but if it works beautifully, they'll pass some of those, if not all the savings, on to the customers. But there's an empirical question now of what is the shampoo budget of a chain like Hilton, which I suspect pays a lot of attention to that. You're saying it's a trivial thing. It's not a trivial thing. It's a huge amount of money. They were buying a lot of those little bottles, and now they are saving some money on the dispenser in that it's a larger bottle. There's less packaging. But my guess is there's less shampoo taken by the customer as a result. And that's the much bigger effect. But that's an empirical question. One would have to find that out. But I want to also ask.
If I could jump in there, because that gets me to a challenge for any enterprising graduate student or young scholar out there. That paper needs to be written. Yeah. Because I would challenge your explanation a little bit. Maybe at the margin, is shampoo theft or the small bottles really all that important? It might be.
I don't know.
But
it's an empirical question. I'd love to. Someone's listening to this right now who's in the hotel business, and I'd like to hear from you if you have some insight into this. But the other thing I was going to say is, there's an expression that travel broadens the mind. Alain de Botton, I think we talked about it in the episode we did with him. He points out that travel's great. The only problem is you bring yourself with you. You think you're escaping yourself, but unfortunately, you're only escaping your physical surroundings. Your emotional, mental, spiritual surroundings come along for the ride, and it's sometimes hard to find travel to be as ennobling as it is sometimes said to be. But what is true is when you travel, you confront different customs and norms. The fruit example is a perfect one that I just mentioned. Recent episode hasn't aired yet, Tony, so you haven't heard it, but I interviewed Joe McReynolds about Tokyo. A lot of people attribute Tokyo's uniqueness to the fact that it's in Japan. It's the Japanese-ness of Tokyo that makes it Tokyo, meaning there's cultural things, and that may be true. We got into a great conversation about how it is that there's so many restaurants with only 10 seats. That's going to be a less profitable experience for the owner, which maybe in America or other countries might not be viable compared to their alternatives. There's 1,000 questions to ask about a 10-seat restaurant or the prevalence of 10-seat restaurants that we didn't get to fully explore. But when you travel, you pick up your head from the phone just for a minute, you will see that the world is not the same in every place, which asks, if you're a curious person, causes you to ask, why? And there's two aspects to it. One is to notice. That's a huge thing. The second is to then try to think about why it might be the case that it's different here than it is there. So it's a wonderful, for me, reading is the way I usually indulge my curiosity. You read new ideas and new claims and new concepts, new perspectives. But travel is another way that you expand your vision.
I agree. I love that podcast that you referred to about the travel, because it was not just seeing different things, but is traveling off the beaten path. You don't have to always see the Eiffel Tower or the Louvre or something. Just go, 10 miles down the road to a local cafe and just sit and watch people and what they do, how they behave. The world is filled with so much wonderful things that we should all sit and wonder about it, because that leads to a more fulfilling life, a more fulfilling scholarly life, and just one in general.
My guest today has been Anthony Gill. Tony, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
My pleasure.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.